Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is Michael Leslie, Associate Professor of International and Intercultural Communication at the University of Florida, and I'm welcoming you to the first of a three-series webinar on bias. We will feature three different topics in this conversation. The first will be on what is bias, that's the one we're having today, and it will cover both what the unconscious and conscious forms of bias. We'll discuss whether it's a form of discrimination or prejudice, and we'll talk about race and other factors that might influence or activate bias. That's today. On Thursday, November 1st, we'll have a panel that will discuss how we can avoid bias and how it can be attenuated from a human resource management perspective. And we'll discuss some tools that are available to ensure that the hiring process is fair and eliminates unconscious favoritism at work. The last in our three-part series will be a panel discussion on how to cope with bias. That will be on November 8th from 1 to 2 p.m. also. And on this panel, we will discuss how one can react or should react when confronted with bias or discrimination. And if we can't escape it, how do we cope with it? And including how we can prevent it from happening to us if we can. And the role of allies can play in eliminating or addressing that bias when it happens to us. So for today's panel, we are pleased to have two very distinguished panelists. The first is Dr. Neil Goodman, who is CEO of Global Dynamics Incorporated and is an internationally recognized authority on diversity, equity, and inclusion. He's a leader in DEI since 1963, and his article, Best Practices in Unconscious Bias Training, is listed #1 on Google. He received SIETAR's 1995 Outstanding Senior Interculturalist Achievement Award, and he is Professor Emeritus at St. Peter's University and a global citizen. Welcome to the panel, Dr. Goodman. Wayne Henry, our second panelist today, grew up in rural Oregon and spent over 8 years in Japan, first as a student and later working in higher education. He met his British wife in Tokyo and relocated in Europe for 15 years. He relocated to Florida in 2014 and began his intercultural training and consulting company here. So Neil and Wayne, welcome. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your personal journey and what led you to be on this panel today.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Michael. This is Neil Goodman, and welcome everyone. And Michael, thank you so much for coordinating this webinar. I think this is a wonderful opportunity to get to meet each of you and to learn from each other. I believe that any program on bias requires that we reveal ourselves as facilitators and trainers and discuss our own biases as well. So I just wanted to share my evolution, which probably will reveal some of my biases that I've picked up along the way. So I would just start from very quickly to say I was raised primarily in a relatively economically disadvantaged family in Jersey City. My parents were Republicans, of all things. And what I became aware of very early in life was the anti-Semitism that existed both in the US and around the world, and of course the results of World War II, what had happened there. I happened to be invited to go to a youth leadership conference back in 1963, which coincided with the March on Washington. It was the same week, and it was there that I led my first intercultural and diversity training program. So I've been doing this now for 55 years. And I had the honor from going to that seminar, starting to do some work around equity, and had the opportunity to meet up with Dr. Martin Luther King and do some work together with him. And because of my activities, I was invited to go to St. Peter's University as a student because they wanted to diversify the student body. Somewhat ironically, because I went to St. Peter's College, which is a Jesuit liberal arts school, I wound up spending my junior year at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, which is not a Jesuit liberal arts school. I went there out of somewhat frustration because I really thought between 63 and 67 we would solve the race problem in America. Obviously, I didn't do a very good job of that. So I went on to the Middle East. I figured I'll create peace in the Middle East. And although I did my best, didn't get very far with that either. So I came back and worked at the United Nations for a while. And when I couldn't bring about world peace, I did what every frustrated idealist does. I became a college professor. And I was invited back to St. Peter's College uh, right after I had graduated and taught there for 35 years and now professor emeritus. Uh, while my time at St. Peter's, I started the first intercultural studies program, which was a combination of social sciences, sociology, and the business school. So we reached across to other disciplines as well. In 1983, I was getting a little bored being a professor, and I was honored to be invited to the East West Center, which was a think tank in Hawaii. And the East West Center was really the hotbed at the time for interculturalists. Virtually every single leader in the field was coming through the East West Center at that time. And I was assigned to work on projects to create workshops for professors as well as for business people on how to work cross-culturally and how to be effective. I came back from that in '83, started Global Dynamics, which is now one of the, uh, I say, better known names in the field for a combination of diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as cross-cultural competence. So we really work in both spaces, and they complement each other very well. Also, I'm the moderator of the Global Diversity Group on LinkedIn. So that's a little bit about me. The nice thing I'll say about Global Dynamics is we have clients on 4 continents, and we do more work outside of the US than in the US. And it's been a learning experience for me working together with our consultants who are some of the brightest people in the world. So that's a little bit about me, and I look forward to talking to you again in a moment. Turn it over now to Wayne.
Hello, everyone. I'm Wayne Henry. So I'm very honored to be on a panel with Dr. Goodman. It's a tough act to follow, but so a little bit about me. I grew up, as Michael said, in rural Oregon and had the opportunity to go to Japan. And that was a fantastic experience for me and launched me into the interculturalist realm. So what a drastic change from Oregon to Tokyo. Completely unprepared, and I learned the hard way about cultural differences. But really loved my time in Japan and ended up being there for 8 years. Certainly changed my life in many ways. Started there as a student, really tried to immerse myself there, and later ended up working at a university, Tokyo International University, helping with international students coming to Japan. So I was like a big brother and helping them with their cultural adjustment. Ended up meeting my wife in Tokyo, who is British, and we got engaged and ended up leaving Tokyo and moving to England. I was working in higher education there, started at the University of East Anglia, traveling the world, spent a lot of time in India, Pakistan, all over Africa, Middle East, South America. So really, thrived exploring different cultures and learning about the different environments and helping international students pursue their education in the UK, helping them prepare for that. And also, I was looking after all the study abroad programs, so sending British students out into the world and preparing them for those journeys. So did that for about 10 years, and then we moved to Ireland and did similar work for the National University of Ireland there. And then ended up moving back to America after living abroad for over 20 years, almost 23 years, working for Florida Atlantic University, started a new program there for international students, and did that for a couple of years and decided I wanted to kind of break out on my own and started my own intercultural education business. And was doing lots of different training and advice and consulting, and broaden my services to do other business services. So last year launched Business Upgraders. So we're continuing with the cultural training, but also doing various business services is for a large variety of clients. So that's what I'm doing at the moment. So Neil's definitely the first expert in this. So I'm again honored to be on a panel with him, but delighted to add some of my own insights in the topic.
Yeah, certainly hard. No one is really an expert in this, and we're all still learning. So still trying to get it right. So I'm honored to have you on with me as a panelist as well. Every time I go into a training program, I go in with the attitude that I'm going to learn something great from the participants rather than I'm going to teach them something great. And it's humbling, but it definitely is true. I learn more than I teach. Anyway, I'd like to start the program by just pointing out a couple of things as we're talking about unconscious bias. And, you know, this is one of the best known facts about how bias results in behaviors. And the fact is that while 4% of American men are over 6'2", more than 36% of corporate CEOs are over 6'2". And, you know, what do you think is going on here? Do you think that people are consciously looking to hire tall people to be a CEO? An inch of height has been calculated to be worth $750 a year. So, you know, why is an inch worth $750,000 a year? Are there biases operating? Of course there are. When Google reported its analytics on what comes next when people ask a question, is my son blank or is my daughter blank? The results are when people ask, is my son, the next comment is my son brilliant or is my son a genius? When the person writes, is my daughter, the next response is my daughter fat? Okay, so think about all the biases that go into how we come up with the kinds of thoughts we have, the kinds of decisions, what's prompting us to think. And those, of course, are all part of our unconscious biases. As was introduced, we're going to be looking at the various ways in which bias can occur and all the attributes. So on the next slide, we'll see so this wheel of diversity, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And what I want to point out is that, you know, we can be biased against or about people, or we could be, you know, the recipient of bias from any one of these characteristics, starting with our personalities. Whether you're an introvert or an extrovert can make a big difference in terms of people being biased towards you. What we know is that none of us belongs to just one category. If you look at all these categories, when it comes to bias, there's often a combination of factors that every individual has. And your unique combination is called intersectionality. That's the idea that your identities, such as race or gender, sexual orientation, social class, ability, age, they all overlap and intersect in dynamic ways that shape an individual's experiences. Again, because of the biases that you may have or biases people have about you. For example, we could use, let's say, people who might be categorized as Latino, but are Latinos people of color or not? If you're a predominantly light-skinned Chilean living in the United States, are you now a person of color or not? How about that in comparison to a dark-skinned person from Belize who speaks English? Are they a Latino or not because they're from Latin America? It gets complicated, and that's all I'm trying to point out, is that it's very complicated. It's a combination of things that are unique to each individual, and yet we use these categories very often as a baseline for bias. And of course, many of the biases are around all of these things, whether it's your religion, your age, your marital status, gender, all of these things. So we want to keep in mind that this is the nature of what we're talking about. So on the next slide, we want to talk about the relationship between diversity and inclusion. Diversity is a prerequisite to inclusion. So you first have to have diversity, then you get inclusion. We just mentioned the many characteristics of diversity in the wheel. But you know, that's diversity. But when you think of inclusion, what do you think of? What is inclusion in your mind? And well, how does that tie to this issue of bias? You know, I say that inclusion is creating a welcoming environment that accepts each individual's differences, embraces their strengths, encourages involvement, and provides equal opportunities and information for all to achieve their full potential. One easy way to think of this is, you know, we cannot, you know, we can have diversity without inclusion, but we can't have inclusion without diversity. Diversity is a prerequisite. Diversity is reality, but inclusion is a choice. In the business world or in education, diversity is how we hire, but inclusion is how we manage the people that we hire. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Wayne, who will talk about some other aspects of diversity, integration, and inclusion.
Yeah, so I wanted to kind of apply this concept to the realm of education, where most of my career, and we certainly hear about diversity and inclusion and integration on most university campuses. So there isn't a university in the world that hasn't tried to gain international students, get the diversity on either domestic diversity or international students there to get the diversity. And the issue often is, right, we've got them on campus, but they're all hanging out with each other. So there's the Indian students hanging out, the Chinese students hanging out together. We got the African American students hanging out, or maybe the African students hanging out, but there's not much mingling, and there's a lot of frustration and concern from university advisors, and they really want to help them integrate. So how do we do that? And a lot of pressure towards the international students to get involved on campus. And there's very little, in my experience, there's very little attention towards the domestic students, you know, and having that inclusion piece. So welcoming the students and having that, you know, helping them take advantage of the international students on campus and interact with those international people or diverse students on campus. But of course, you know, they have the same tendencies as everyone else, that we, as humans, we tend to stick together of people that are similar. And I like this graph here, where we certainly, you know, as Neil said, we can't have inclusion without diversity. But on campuses, if you look at the left-hand side, we certainly have integration, technically integration, it's not segregation. So we have integration of international students on campus, but as in this graph or in this graphic, they're often clumped together. So they're, you know, they have access to all of the facilities on campus. They can go to classes. They can, you know, go to the gym, the cafeteria. You know, they have access to everything, but they're doing it often in groups where interculturalists or those in education want to see on the right inclusion. So people are mixed up. They're interacting, gaining experience from each other, gaining insights from each other. You know, getting that access. And the thing that's often missing on campuses is, again, that, you know, to have inclusion, you have to have a active effort to work with the domestic students, to give them reason to want to welcome and include the diverse student groups. So I thought it would be worth mentioning that in this presentation.
Okay, so this is Neil. I thought we could look at a couple of quick questions. The first one is, you know, our biases always have negative consequences for other people. Is that, you know, true or false? And if you want to type into the chat box what you think your answer is, that would be great. We'd also like you to write any questions you might have in the chat box, so we can hopefully have time to respond to those a little bit later. Or if it's something immediate, we can respond to it right away. So what are your thoughts on that? Our biases always have negative consequences for other people. And then okay, we got some responses I can see already from Patricia. So let's look at the next question. Whoops. I'll go to the next question for a moment, please. Yeah. Does having bias make you a bad person? Does that make you a bad person? So again, what are your thoughts to that? Does it make you a bad person? Okay. Put in your responses. Okay. So again, and we can go back one slide now. So in terms of the definition of bias, so clearly the answer to both of those should be no. We have biases, and they don't always have negative consequences. It doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a human being if you have biases. For our purposes today, we'll define bias as any thought or action, whether intentional or unintentional, that provides someone with an unfair advantage or disadvantage. It can be positive or it can be negative. We often think of bias only in a negative way, but it can be either positive or negative. Many people are surprised to realize that bias can be positive, but an example of a positive bias that you might have is, I may be biased towards people who graduated from the same school as I did. I trust them more. I think they'll do a better job. Again, that may be my bias. Again, we have biases about all kinds of things, whether it's religion or regions or whatever. But with a clear understanding of the meaning and definition of unconscious bias, we can gain an appreciation of how bias might impact how we work and where we go to school and the people we interact with in our communities. So how do you know when your thoughts might be biased? One good clue would be if you use the word all as part of your thought process. When you think of somebody, say, all people are like that. That's a good example of you being biased. So all women are nurturing, all Asians are good at math. All of these kinds of generalizations which are foolish. But if you have that and that comes into your mind, then you have a bias. And it's obviously impossible to live in a society without biases because every society has them. They're norms of the society. When we did a program, Unconscious Bias in China, the bias was heavily against rural people versus urban people, just as an example. So you don't even have to think of the term all. But bias is that small voice inside your head that whispers, I've known someone similar to you, so I know what you're going to be like. On the other hand, it's probably not a bias if your first thoughts are flexible. Well, some Gen X's change jobs a lot, but others don't. Or loud conversations don't always mean conflict. Maybe loud people are very creative. Or not everyone who dresses like that does sloppy work. So to summarize, if you notice you're thinking in terms of all or most people, that's a good way to spot a bias. If biases are problematic, then why do we have them? And so if we look at the next slide, which talks about our brains at work, really our brains are responsible for a lot of our biases. We've learned biases, obviously, but our brain, research has been done now that talks about how the brain functions. And clearly the brain functions first as a prediction machine, seeking the simplest path to conclusions, and it's wired for threat. Biases help us to make quick decisions, even if they're inaccurate decisions. If you have a brain, you have biases. We work with a group of investors, and they wanted unconscious bias training because they were investing with people based on inaccurate information, such as how old the person was, what schools they went to, whether they were male or female. Sometimes they gave money to people they shouldn't have given money to. Think of Bernie Madoff, who got all his money because people were biased towards him. So we make bad decisions a lot of times because of our biases. Now, our unconscious bias, our unconscious brain rather, can overrule our best intentions. So we've got to be very careful. Human survival required that we be able to quickly determine if a person or a situation was a threat or was safe. Human beings have been we're about 10,000 generations old. That's about it. And most of the time that we've been alive as human beings, most of that time, over those 10,000 generations, the issue of fear was the most important issue. You know, it was that whole idea of fight or flight. Uh, and it's important to keep that idea in mind, that our brain is really wired for fear and for threat. And that's why so many demagogues like Hitler and other nationalists get their power by promoting fear of others, by stressing how others are going to be dangerous, and then use that to gain power. So people are wired for fear. We have to realize that demagogues take advantage of that. In MRI tests, when we're shown a photo of someone who looks like us, there's increased activity in the reward center of the brain. So that means that we not just feel rewarded, but we feel more empathetic towards the person who's like us. When we're shown photos of those who are very different from us, the fear and threat areas of the brain activate, and we have a difficult time being empathetic. We're unconsciously indifferent to their success or their failure. So again, we're more empathetic towards people like us, less empathetic to people who are not like us. It's not a question of who's a good person or a bad person, because there's no way we can know every truth about every culture or every stranger. Our brain makes quick categorizations to compartmentalize the information coming at us, and our brain looks for what is familiar to us. If someone is more like us, they're going to be good. It allows us to navigate the world. So that's what the brain does. It really simplifies the world, allows us to make quick decisions, and of course, hidden inside of all of that are the biases that we have. But those of us in the field of intercultural studies, those of us in the diversity and inclusion area, we know that we have to be consciously using our brain to overcome the easy path of prejudice. Understanding how to get out from under the limiting beliefs we have will enable us to contribute more to society and also be more innovative. Cultural neurosciences help us to understand the need to create paradoxical curiosity, that is, the curiosity about differences. One other point I'll make here is that Daniel Kahneman, who received the Nobel Prize in economics for developing the theory of system one, system two thinking. System one thinking is fast thinking. It's relying on your biases to think fast. You use your common assumptions and emotions. It's the first thing that comes to mind, and it's less rational. Thinking slow requires that you thoughtfully consider the situation using all of the data available. It requires more effort, so we're less inclined to use it. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn it over to Wayne, who will tell us about another type of brain, the reptilian brain.
Yeah, so Neil pretty much said it all, but I just wanted to highlight, I actually got this from the last national SIETAR conference. That's I found quite fascinating, and it's right about the fight or flight response. So what Neil mentioned was part of the reptilian brain. So the most the stem in our brain. So we share that with simplest creatures in the world, and it's based on our fight or flight. So it's innate, it's unconscious, and it's saying basically what Neil mentioned is those that are similar to us is safe, and the things that are different from us we need to flee from, we need to be fearful of, and that's just a survival instinct that's ingrained in all creatures on Earth, really, and it's still in the deepest parts of our brain. So it's nothing that we can control consciously. That's kind of an innate response. As Neil said, the MRI shows, those that are similar to us, we feel safe. Those that are different, we feel unsafe. So we need to be aware of that. Another term that I've heard is, there's a predisposition to that. So I think people that are similar to us, we feel safe. But the thing to remember is that, that can only be changed by experience. So if we actively pursue to engage with those that are different than us, different from us, then we can replace those negative associations with positive ones. And the danger is, maybe our only perception of someone that is different may come from the media, which is inaccurate and can be used against other people, and certainly have, as Neil said about Hitler and others, building on those fears and criminalizing those and saying, you need to be fearful of these other people. They're dangerous. So the only way to get over that is to experience firsthand people who are not like you, which is innately fearful for many people. So through those interactions, people learn, oh, that person or those group of people isn't like what I feared or what I thought. I've had a positive experience, and then moving forward, that fear is depressed or gone. So I think it's really important that we understand, how our brains are wired, and that is natural. It doesn't mean we have to, go along with it and feed into those fears that we may naturally have, and bravely try to experience interacting with others that are different, and try to keep an open mind, and overcome maybe this natural fear that we have.
Great. So that brings us to the question of, why do we have the biases, and where do they come from? And I think, what Wayne had just said is really important, that we have this predisposition to have biases. It's important to think that how we can overcome that. I know the next couple of webinars are going to talk about that. But it's important to realize that, as was illustrated earlier, just by bringing people together physically does not promote overcoming our biases. It does not promote intercultural understanding. There really needs to be an external force motivating people to work together, to have a superordinate goal, and to reward people for engaging in interactions with people different from themselves. It just does not come naturally, and that's why those of us in the field really have to go out of our way to create those situations and those environments where people can come together, so they can work more effectively together and be understanding of one another. When I started doing work in the field, the main goal was to become tolerant of one another. Well, today I think if you just said to people, learn how to tolerate each other, we wouldn't think that was progress at all. We're now talking about inclusion, which is a very different concept than tolerance. Anyway, let's talk about where the biases come from, and these are this is a short list. Obviously, there's a lot more, but certainly we learn our first biases from our families, and a lot of times we're surprised when we realize that our families are in fact biased, and then we have to deal with that as we grow older. Education obviously also perpetuates bias in the schools, and again we see this. It's sometimes very unintentional, but it still occurs. One study that was done that I always like to point to was having teachers who were teaching in nursery school level, so very young children, and they were asked to watch a video, and in the video they saw 4 children playing, a white boy, a white girl, a black boy, and a black girl, and they were told to watch out for behavior that may be dangerous or problematic, and then they recorded them. And as you might imagine, overwhelmingly the teachers saw that the black boy, even though these children were all 4 years old or so, was the one who was engaging in problematic behavior. Well, of course, there was no problematic behavior in the video. That's the key. There was no problematic behavior. But more importantly, and this is where schools come in, the teachers didn't know that people who were being tested, these teachers didn't know that their retinas were being scanned, so that during the video, their retinas were being scanned, and unbeknownst to the teachers and unconsciously, when the teachers were told to look for behaviors that were problematic, they immediately looked towards the black boy. Now, again, these are 4-year-olds. So if teachers unwittingly start categorizing children at the age of 4 and look for bad behavior from some children and good behavior from other children, you can see how this unconscious bias, continues to develop over time, and how those biases, lead to much greater racism in the society. Of course, we get our biases from social media, and really from all media. I knew growing up, I was fearful of Native Americans, because every cowboy and Indian show that I ever saw, showed the white people as being, the good guys, and the Indians being the murderous, people attacking the innocent white people. So again, that was the social media. That was my bias growing up, based on the television that I saw. Took me a long time to unlearn those prejudices. Our group affiliations obviously play a role. Overall, our culture does. Certainly, religions are a bedrock for lack of understanding, not just understanding. We hope that religions bring people together, but probably more people have died in the name of religion than maybe for any other single cause other than diseases. So religion can teach us to be respectful of one another, and I certainly support the Tannenbaum Institute for Religious Understanding, and I'm a consultant for them. But at the same time, we have to understand that religions can have negative impact on understanding as well. And finally, in the workplace, we need to understand that our workplaces, again, consistently impact and perpetuate biases if they're not keenly aware of the biases that exist by the leaders, by the managers, the employees, so that people can consciously overcome their biases. So let's look at one other slide, and that this comes from again another study that was done that not too long ago. Orchestra leaders, who were almost always male, believed that the French horn could only be played by males because it was a relatively heavy instrument. Now, today, most orchestras conduct their auditions for new candidates behind curtains, so that those evaluating the musicians cannot tell their gender. So somebody playing the French horn, you don't know if it's a male or a female. By having people audition behind curtains, this resulted in a 45% increase in the number of women selected into major philharmonic orchestras, including women who played the French horn. So those who were doing the selecting said they had no biases. They didn't realize they were being biased, but clearly they did have a blind spot when they saw a male versus seeing a female. So putting people behind the curtain eliminated some of those blind spots. So the question is, what blind spots do you have? What about your coworkers? We all have blind spots. We have to identify them and address them. These are biases we don't know that we possess, and they're beyond our awareness. And today we realize that we're not aware of them, and they are unintentional. Unconscious biases influence our actions every day, but without realizing it. Sometimes these mental shortcuts cause us to make inaccurate assumptions about people, influencing the way we treat them and the decisions we make about them. This impacts employee and customer engagement, bottom line business results, and of course, student results in schools. These webinars have been developed to help us become aware of the changes necessary to understand where personal and collective unconscious biases come from, and the functions that they serve, and how it impacts the quality of our day-to-day decision-making at school and in business. So this is the baseline from which we're starting, and I'd now like to turn it back to Wayne if you have any other comments, and then open it up for questions and answers to see if there are any questions that people have.
Yeah, I really love this slide and this idea, and just related again to the education sector. I was seeing in Europe before I left, that a lot of universities were moving towards blind grading. So exams and papers were being turned in with just a number, not a name, to force that the professors were grading the work in front of them, nothing to do with their idea of the student or any track record there. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I'm wondering how many American schools do that.
Don't know. I haven't heard of it here, but yeah.
I know
Yeah,
a lot of businesses try to have blank resumes without names on it as well.
Yeah, I know there was a case in the UK that I remember that there was a lawsuit from an applicant who submitted the exact same application and resume, just changed the name, and one was called to interview and the other one wasn't. So he sued for discrimination and won. So it certainly happens.
Yeah, and those things happen by people who would consciously say that they are not biased.
Sure.
Do we have any questions that have come in over time? We wanted to make sure we left plenty of time for discussions and questions. So does anyone have any?
Well, as your moderator, I have a question for both of you, and it's probably more in the purview of the panel that's going to follow, but I would like you to address it also, and that's that in my work here at the university, we have often people will say, okay, if you're going to tell me about bias and its impact, that's a lecture. I already know this to begin with, that I shouldn't be biased, but I am, and I'm not going to change my behavior, or the people that you lecture to aren't going to change their behavior based on the lecture. So I'm always wondering what I can tell people who want to have other people be less biased in the treatment of them, but don't really think that giving them a lecture about bias and the sources of it is going to make a difference.
Well, I would say, it's important that people know the facts, that they're knowledgeable about what trends are there, show data, so they just are aware and they can't deny it. So we can't force someone to act in a certain way, but ignorance is to perpetuate ignorance certainly doesn't gonna help with making any changes. So that would be kind of my view, that promoting information, promoting, just saying, yeah, this is a natural tendency, but there are certain ways that, we can overcome this, give examples like the, selection for the musicians or blind grading. There are simple techniques that can be used that prevent people from, succumbing to their natural tendencies of bias, and having a more fair platform for choosing.
Yeah, and this is Neil. I would say that, first of all, any program has to be extremely interactive. Lectures will get you zero influence and zero impact. These workshops have to be engaging, interactive, emotional, and even stressful. But one of the things that I will say is that every time we do a workshop, we spend a lot of time collecting critical incidents and actual cases from the organization, so that the organizations are confronted with actual situations that are happening in their organization that they cannot deny. For example, a recent one where a woman who was of a Puerto Rican background, who is one of the top scientists in the organization, talked about how it took her over a year in the organization before anyone took her seriously because of her accent. And people were just shocked because they knew how brilliant she was. So again, they didn't realize how oftentimes they were biased against people who have accents. That's just one example. But we've done similar things in the healthcare industry, where we've showed that doctors spent less time examining people of color than white people. They didn't do it consciously. It was unconscious. But these kinds of biases happen all the time. And so you have to use actual examples, and then we put those examples in front of them, and we have them brainstorm. How are we going to overcome these? How are we going to stop this in the future? We give them some very practical tips on how they might be able to overcome the biases, whether it's in hiring, recruiting, promoting, whatever it might be, because they're dealing with this on a day-to-day business. And believe me, organizations know that if they're going to be successful, they have to be inclusive. There's a direct correlation between inclusivity and profitability. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, that was quite helpful. That was quite helpful. Can you give your audience, the attendees, and even myself as moderator, some information about how you make your services available and to both organizations, private and public organizations like universities?
Yeah, I'll take that. This is Neil. First, fortunately, we don't really do any promotional work. That is, we don't do any advertising. Obviously, I do a lot of public speaking, and not just obviously spoken at SIETAR many times and other professional associations. And also, I write quite a bit. And for those of you who are interested in articles in this area, if you write to me, I'll send you a list of linked articles, all about unconscious bias and micro-messaging, etc. So a lot of times we'll get contacted as a result of some of the articles that I've written, but generally it's word of mouth. 100% of our business comes from word of mouth, from clients who talk about us to other potential clients. So that's usually how people find us.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I provide various training and services. So some of it's online, some of it's in person. So I have a variety of very flexible in the mode of delivery. I'm IDI qualified, so I use that tool quite often to kind of get the baseline for just the intercultural competence of the staff involved, and then design a curriculum according to their needs there. So that's typically what I do.
Great. So we're coming to the end of our program. I wonder if there are any other questions from the attendees. And if there's not, I want to thank our panelists, Dr. Neil Goodman and Wayne Henry, for generously contributing your time to this webinar on bias. And we look forward to having you participate in future sessions of the Florida SIETAR group in the near future. Thank you very much.